Welcome back to this lecture on the Bible and postcolonialism. This lecture will be spent entirely on postcolonial theory and how that theory has influenced biblical scholars in the past 2 decades, really. Here you have the relief of the Ark of Titus, which is in Rome, and Titus was the son of Vespasian and the emperor of Rome not long after the destruction of Jerusalem in 78 of the Common Era. And if you see here, these are Judeans who are being forced into slavery and carrying the utensils from the temple in Jerusalem back to Rome. So this is basically the subjugation of the Jews or the Judeans after the destruction of the temple. So here you can see in relief how Rome celebrated this victory over the Jewish revolt from 66 to 70. So this just gives you a great physical example of why colonialism and imperialism is important when we deal with biblical interpretation. I mean, this is what's happening in the first century. So how does the Bible refract under the lens of postcolonial theory? And I mean, the bigger question is, what is postcolonial theory? So this whole lecture will kind of be broken down into 3 segments. Some definitions, postcolonial definitions. Then we're going to look at postcolonialism in biblical studies. And then finally, postcolonialism in the letter of James. So we'll look at postcolonialism and biblical studies in general, and then postcolonialism in the letter of James itself. So that's how this whole lecture will be broken down. So let's look at some postcolonial definitions. This picture here, you know what, I'm going to back up for a second. This book by Edward Said is called Orientalism. It is considered by many the founding document of postcolonial theory. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I just wanted to back up and let you know what that picture was so that you can, know what that is. I didn't mean to bypass that. Here, this picture is a satire of British imperialism. And at one point, at the height of the British Empire, it was true that the sun never set on the British Empire because so much of the world was under British rule. And at one point, 96% of the world was colonized by European countries. And that is just hard to get your head around. And so, what happens when several countries rule the world? Well, the major scholars who came up with postcolonial theory, and I don't think any of them would self-identify as postcolonial theorists as such, but this holy trinity of postcolonial theory would be Edward Said, Homi K. Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak. Gayatri Spivak is a woman from India, Homi K. Bhabha is a man from India, and Edward Said is a man from Palestine. So Edward Said's charter document, Orientalism, basically Said shows how the field of Orientalism is itself racist and used to empower the British Empire. with scientific knowledge to subjugate other places. So what Said does is say that the British Empire would colonize a place, or they would send missionaries or anthropologists into a place. They would study a place, and then they would say how primitive the place was and how the people there didn't know how to govern themselves and things of that nature. And then they would send that scientific information back to the homeland, back to the center of empire, and that's what would be taught as science. And so, in the center of the empire, this gave reason and rationale for the British to go and colonize. And so colonization for the British was seen as a civilizing force. They had to go help these cultures become civilized and learn English and things of that nature. So that's called hegemonic discourse and hegemony. When you create reasons to colonize and basically say, these people need us. They need our help to survive. They don't know how to govern themselves. So we're going to go in and help govern them, because look at what this, this field of study says, that they can't do it on their own. And that is the nature of Orientalism. So the Orient, or the East, Said says, is a creation of the British Empire, in the sense that it created the discourse around the Orient in order to subjugate it. So that is pretty terrible in and of itself. And the way Edward Said does that is pretty ingenious in Orientalism. He wrote several other works, but the most important for this kind of work is Culture and Imperialism, that came out in 1994. And Said died in the early part of the 21st century. He was actually coming to the campus where I was working on my PhD to speak, and it was that year that he passed away. He was suffering with cancer and died. So Edward Said is a pretty controversial figure, but one of the major contributors to what became postcolonial theory. Homi K. Bhabha is, if Edward Said is one of the founding scholars in postcolonial theory, Homi Bhabha may be the one who is the most useful as far as creating a vocabulary around postcolonial theory. His work, Culture, Location of Culture, and Narrating Nation, those two are seminal works in what is now postcolonial theory. And Bhabha is the one who created the vocabulary around hybridity, mimicry, and ambivalence. And these are very technical postcolonial terms. They certainly have regular meanings, but the way they're used in postcolonial theory is very technical. So hybridity, Bhabha uses to describe the encounter between a colonized and a colonizing culture. When the imperial culture contacts the native culture, as soon as that cultural contact happens, hybridity becomes real. And so hybridity is the cultural amalgamation when colonizing and colonized cultures interact. And it is always, there's always a power discrepancy here. There's a colonizing force and a colonized force. And when these two cultures interact, that is cultural hybridity. So when the native learns to speak the imperial language, when the empire, in their subjugation of the colonized culture, learns the native language, when things become translated from empire language to native language. This is all part of hybridity, and Baba argues that hybridity is a different thing. It is more than both of the cultures and less than both. In other words, when the native is colonized, the native becomes less than native, but more than both native and colonizer. So it's less than one and doubled. He uses that quite a bit in Location of Culture. So hybridity is this identity that happens in the cultural exchange between colonizer and colonized. Mimicry is a place of resistance, and specifically resistance from below. And this is when the native begins to mimic the colonizer, speak the colonizer's language, wear the colonizer's clothes, incorporate and assimilate the colonial culture in an attempt to overthrow. So mimicry bleeds into mockery. There's all these stories in British literature about how natives learned how to speak English really well, better than the Queen's English kind of thing, and they perform. It's a performance. They perform at this high level, so much so that the British almost grant them civilization. And if they weren't native, then the British would definitely say that they are civilized, but they're never fully British. I mean, that's the inevitable outcome. You can perform British, but you can never be British. And I think in America, this happens a lot with code switching, especially on racial and ethnic lines. The tragedy of America, and I've gotten a lot of pushback about this among colleagues, but I've argued that the economy in America is largely white. To be able to be in a Fortune 500 company, you've got to talk white. You've got to speak white. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying that's kind of the insidious part of business culture, that the economy in America is a white culture, and to live and breathe within that economy and to move ahead, by and large, you have to perform whiteness. And that is a form of mimicry too. And I think it's the one that, when we talk about imperialism and cultural imperialism, it's easy to look at British imperialism and French imperialism and Belgium and Dutch and Spain and Portugal and show how insidious this is. But even in the United States, on racial levels, the economy is white, and you have to perform to get it. This is why school teachers tell kids that you gotta clean up your language when you interview for a job, and this is called, the technical term for that is called code switching. So that when you go into one environment, you know how to speak the language in that environment and pass in order to get a job or something like that. It is insidious, and I think this is kind of the root of power discrepancy in race in America, and the deep-seated roots of historic racism in America. So mimicry is a way to kind of revolt from within kind of thing, where the native performs imperial culture, but does so in an attempt to overthrow and to take back the native lands. But the way they do this, they take back the native land by performing imperial culture. And so this is kind of the inevitable outcome of imperialism, according to Baba. Imperialism is doomed to fail because it has within it the seeds of its own destruction. And the problem at the end of the day is when mimicry is used as a means of resistance. If the resistance is successful and the empire is overthrown, what happens then? Does those who are able to perform imperial culture then become the ruling elite that turns back to its own culture and subjugates it, just like the empire did? You see that happen over and over again. And Frantz Fanon, who was the Martinican scholar who fought in the Algerian Revolution in 1968, Frantz Fanon argued that this is absolutely what you're supposed to do. But after the empire is overthrown, after the revolt happens, immediately you have to go into social consciousness for everybody, or you'll have a ruling elite that is just another form of colonialism, and that's called neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism. And this happened a lot in the subcontinent of India and in the continent of Africa post-independence. So Fanon's warning there is almost prophetic. But this is the nature of how mimicry turns into monstrosity. And then that last word that Baba popularized was ambivalence. And ambivalence is the within the native, this compulsion, this desire to have imperial culture, and a revulsion against it, and the desire to resist and not want it. So this ambivalence, you're caught with both a desire to assimilate colonial culture and a desire to resist it. And that is kind of this psychological state that all natives go through, where there's some things that they really want from the colonizing culture, but at the same time they hate the fact that they want it. And this, again, on economic levels, this is very similar to what happens in America a lot with consumerism, right? You see the kind of the opulence of wealth, and it just makes you sick that people are so greedy and wealthy, and yet you want that for yourself, right? I mean, this is quintessential post-colonial ambivalence, and Baba theorizes about ambivalence a lot. So you look at these three terms, and they become, these three terms in themselves that Baba uses become very important when you turn to using post-colonial theory as a lens to read Scripture. So in the cultural hybridity that produced the Bible from the Assyrian Empire to the Roman Empire, where do we read moments of hybridity, mimicry, and ambivalence in the biblical text? And how does the biblical text refract under that lens? These are the main questions in post-colonial biblical criticism. So, but before we move on, I want to talk about Gayatri Spivak too. Gayatri Spivak wrote a very difficult article to read called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" And subaltern are those who are the most oppressed, doubly oppressed, triply oppressed. So women tend to be more oppressed than men in most cultures. So what does it mean to be a woman at the bottom of the social ladder, or the class ladder, or specifically in India, the caste system? What does it mean to be a woman, Dalit, or untouchable, and under British rule, right? So this is so subaltern, so oppressed that they can't speak. They don't even have a voice in order to be literate and to write is to not be subaltern. So her article, "Can the Subaltern Speak?" is it really kind of pushes that question about the agency of the subaltern. And this becomes very important in postcolonial biblical criticism about how the oppressed resist. And in resistance, by the fact that people have agency to resist, does that mean already that they are not subaltern? The fact that they have agency. Gayatri Spivak problematizes that and brings that issue to bear on in her work. And I think she's very difficult to read, and Homike Bhabha is as well. But they are intentionally obtuse. They're intentionally difficult to read. It's almost the way they resist is to write in such dense English language that it's hard to understand. I mean, it's almost a form of resistance. Their form of academic discourse. But goodness, if you can wade through some of those deep waters, what they're trying to do, I think, is very ethical. And even though Baba has been called apolitical, his work is very political. His attempt to describe, he creates, and what he creates is a way to resist in a lot of ways. So while these authors, and I'm not giving you any text to read from these folks during our class, but if you want to do some extra reading, Said's Orientalism and Cultural Imperialism, Baba's Location of Culture, which is a collection of essays, and Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak?, which is a fairly short article. She's written a lot, but these were all formed by literary theory. These guys they are all English professors. They work within English departments, and they kind of apply their work to literature in ways that shows how English literature itself, what narratives themselves, or fiction, works of fiction themselves, were a way to create an image of the Orient or the image of the native in a way that made it okay to colonize, and that is it's insidious. It's but by the fact that they're unearthing that shows that colonialism has no moral backbone whatsoever. And in fact, it's only for subjugation and abstraction of resources from colonized territories. This was not a civilizing agent. This was a devastating agent that robbed whole countries of their resources. and left in its wake human devastation. So there was an old African saying that when the British came to Africa, the British had the Bible and the Africans had the land. And when the British left, the Africans had the Bible and the British had the land. It's devastating to think of colonialism this way. And Aimé Césaire, another Martinican scholar, in his short book, Discourse on Colonialism, he basically said that Europe, the crisis in Europe that helped Europe understand that colonialism was wrong was Nazism. And he basically said that what Hitler did to Europe by basically colonizing Europe and taking Poland and taking France, and that work is what finally helped Europe realize that colonialism was wrong. It's not long after World War II, it's within 20 years of World War II that these former imperial countries of Europe started to let go of some of its territory. Now, they didn't let go easily. There was war involved in every space, just about. But Césaire argues that what makes Hitler so terrible and these imperial countries not terrible. There's no difference, basically, is what Césaire says. What France did to its colonies, what Britain did to its colonies, what Spain and Portugal did to its colonies, what Belgium did to its colonies, is exactly what Hitler was doing to Europe. And what made Hitler evil was the fact that Hitler was doing it to Europe. That's what Césaire's argument is. He said basically to the British Empire and France and all the other countries that had colonies, he said basically what you've been doing to us is what Hitler's done to you. And now that it's happening to you, you realize how bad it is. It's a scathing critique of colonialism, but in profound ways true. I mean, you look at how colonialism operated. These European countries would come into, they would sail around the world. They would find land that they wanted, and they would just take it. They would just absolutely take it. Take it by force or take it by coercion and tell the people how much they were going to help them. And once they were in, they would take all the gold, take all the silver, take all the minerals, take all the diamonds, and ruthlessly subjugate the people. And that was how colonialism worked, and is not very different than what Hitler did to continental Europe. But I will say that there are some ethnic and geographical differences. All empire isn't just the same, and the way the British colonized places was very different than the French, which was very different than the Belgium, which is very different than the Dutch, which was very different than Spain, and very different than Portugal. So all these European countries colonized differently and interacted with the native culture differently. So all colonialism isn't equal. They were equally bad, but they were not all the same. And so the British absolutely had a sense of superiority where they did not want to mix with native cultures, where the French didn't have as much of an issue with that, and the Spanish as well. So the way the empires would associate with local culture was different, but they all were oppressive. No getting around it. So that's kind of post-colonial theory in a nutshell. So what do we do with that in biblical studies? So Postcolonial Biblical Criticism is a collection of essays by Stephen Moore and Fernando Segovia. These are two of the major leading voices in postcolonialism in biblical studies. Both of them are New Testament scholars. Stephen Moore is at Drew University. Fernando Segovia is in Vanderbilt. They've written quite a bit together like this and edited several volumes. But this work basically outlines what postcolonial biblical criticism is. And they do it in, they basically say postcolonial theory manifests itself in biblical studies in at least three ways. One is X and Empire. And there's a guy named Warren Carter out of Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. Warren, I think, is Australian or New Zealand. I can't remember, but he writes like this. He basically he has two books. One is Matthew and Empire and John and Empire. So you can't get more X and Empire than Warren. But his work is all about reading the biblical text and finding empire in it. So every place in a text where you can find Roman imperialism, in particular in the Gospel of Matthew or in the Gospel of John, that's how you use postcolonial theory. So it's a very historical way, kind of historical critical way to do biblical studies, but with an emphasis on empire as you do biblical studies. And I think that the last lecture where I talked about the Babylonian Empire's influence on the writing of Scripture from Genesis to Daniel to Isaiah, and the Persian imperial influence on Ezra and Nehemiah, the Roman influence on all of the New Testament. That's kind of X and Empire, where you're not using the technical vocabulary of postcolonial theory as much as paying attention to empire in the New Testament. Where does empire come up? What passages speak directly to Rome in the New Testament? How is the Roman Empire negotiated in these things? So that's kind of the nature of X and Empire. The other form of postcolonial biblical criticism that happens is using postcolonial theory to read the Bible for liberation. And this is very similar to liberation theology and liberation hermeneutics, where you use this critical lens to find empire only to resist it, right? Siddhartha Raja is one of the key components to this. He's an Indian New Testament scholar, and Siddhartha Raja is just fantastic. He's got several books out. He's a professor in the UK now, but his work, I think, is part and parcel a liberation hermeneutics. But he uses postcolonial theory to do that. He finds these places in the Bible where biblical texts are resisting empire, and he holds it up as a way to resist today. And so this form of postcolonialism in biblical studies is deeply rooted in liberation theology and reads for liberation. And then the final form of this is postcolonial biblical criticism proper, and that's where scholars don't necessarily use the biblical text to resist empire as much as they use postcolonial technical vocabulary to show how deeply rooted the Bible itself is within imperial culture. So the Revelation, for instance, while the Revelation is probably the most anti-Roman book of the New Testament, I mean, there's visions of absolute catastrophe for Rome. Rome will fall like Babylon, right? Rome will be destroyed. There's death and hell and all this violence. Well, that's certainly anti-Roman, but the vision of the new heaven and new earth is not anti-imperial. In fact, that vision is utterly imperial. So the vision of an alternative reality in the Revelation isn't some non-imperial entity. As a matter of fact, God and God's empire, God's kingdom, is just like the Roman Empire as a colonizing force. It just is more powerful. And so the Roman Empire then is just inverted and turned on its head, and God is on top. This is mimicry for sure. But these scholars that are in this mode of discourse show how the biblical text itself is deeply rooted within a colonial framework, even when it tries to resist Roman Empire, or even when the biblical text resists any kind of empire, it does so from within. And so it shows the kind of the problematic nature of these biblical texts. So rather than just saying, hey, look, you can read this text and find empire in it, or hey, look, we're going to read this text through the lens of postcolonial theory in order to to liberate XYZ, these scholars say, hey, look, the Bible is a product of colonial encounter and has within it colonial projects, and that's problematic. So those are three very different ways to do postcolonial theory in the Bible. So let's look at James in particular. I mean, this is the book that we're working on this semester, and we are eventually going to get to the letter itself and actually go through the text verse by verse. But who's doing postcolonialism in James? Well, I am. I mean, this is my book, and this is what we're reading for class. And to date, I'm the only one that's done a thorough postcolonial reading of the entire book of the letter of James. Ingeborg Mongstad Kvamen, she's the president of the Norwegian Bible Society, and she has a book. I'll go ahead and pull that up. So Ingeborg wrote a book, but it only deals with James chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. And her book is called Toward a Postcolonial Reading of the Letter of James. And then the subtitle says chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. So her entire book is an analysis of this text. And it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it if you're interested in James and going deeper. Here she really she does an X and Empire reading where she looks at chapter 2, verses 1 through 13 and talks about the wealthy person that comes into the assembly with nice clothes and a gold ring. And she basically culturally unpacks who that person would be in the Roman world. And it's somebody from the equestrian or senatorial rank because of the gold ring. She goes into really deep detail about these cultural indicators within Roman, the Roman environment. So this isn't just a straw figure. It is an anti-Roman sentiment here. So Gavaman is really good there. Sharon Renge is a retired professor at this point, or an emeritus professor. She does fantastic work, very liberation-oriented. And she is the author of the chapter in James in the post-colonial, the post-colonial commentary of the New Testament. And it is, while she kind of deals with the whole book, it's very brief. I think her whole section in that commentary is only less than 10 pages. So she doesn't deal with the letter of James exhaustively. I mean, the nature of that commentary prohibits that. And then the other person that doesn't do postcolonial theory per se, but is very close in the way he analyzes James is influential on me for sure, and that's Maynard Reed, Pedrito Maynard Reed, and he's a Jamaican scholar. I think he's still in the Caribbean, but his book called Poverty and Wealth in the Letter of James is more of a social scientific reading of the letter, but he really does a great job kind of unpacking some of the social fabric in the letter of James and what does James kind of reveal about his environment in the letter. So I think these are the major readings of the letter of James from a post-colonial perspective. There's just not that many out there. Well, first of all, the academic study of the letter of James, while it is broad, it's just one letter, and it's not like Pauline theology or Pauline thought. I mean, there's so many scholars that work on Paul, and there's so many scholars that work on the Gospels. There's just not that many scholars that work on James. So to have three of us that have written a postcolonial reading of James isn't crazy, but there's just not that many. But what does the postcolonial trajectory do with the letter of James, and what's the future in the study of James? I think the way postcolonial theory is being used and how the world has changed, I think maybe not logical, but a next step would be globalization and how global studies and globalization, that's a different way to think about the world. Instead of seeing the world as a post-colony or using post-colonial theory to kind of look at modern issues, I think globalization is a different way of doing that, a different set of vocabulary to kind of understand the world. And we are definitely living in the age of globalization, more so now than at any point in world history. Our technology is such that we have access to the world in ways that just has never happened before. So I think that's certainly one trajectory from postcolonial theory. Moussa Dubé's work on the Gospel of Matthew, though, and in New Testament studies in general, with a postcolonial feminist reading, that's another good trajectory. And then Joseph Marshall, his work on what Moussa does with postcolonial feminist readings, he says a feminist postcolonial reading. So he kind of elevates the feminist. But I think those are all good ways to engage postcolonial theory moving forward. And maybe some of those will kind of push the boundaries of that threefold division in postcolonial biblical criticism between X and Empire, liberation hermeneutics, and postcolonial biblical criticism. Well, that is the lecture for this section. I will have another lecture by the end of the week, but we won't be quizzed on it just because of time. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, send me an email.